Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Ron with TopStep. Excited to bring you the exciting topic around subcontractor management techniques in OpenAir. So on our agenda today, we're going to talk about some different topics around managing subcontractors. As professional service organizations, we all from time to time, either as a regular practice or one-off, bring in subcontractors to help augment our internal staff. And so I want to highlight some of the challenges and some of the best practice we see from our customers around managing, their access. What kind of level of access do we give those subcontractors? How do we maintain and keep track of our subcontractors? Because generally they come and go, and so we may want to keep them available as a potential resource for us. We want to be able to capture their costs and capture their time appropriately, based on how we need to bill our customer, as well as how we need to report on our projects. We need to be able to share information with them, so we need to make sure we're sharing the right information with them. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that, some of the filtering that we see. And lastly, some of the reports that are centered around contractors. We'll talk about a few of those as well. So what is subcontractor management? As I mentioned, we all bring in subcontractors either as a matter of practice or a matter of bringing them in on a one-off basis to kind of help augment our staff. And so, some of the challenges with subcontractors that we see is, they will vary by cost. You may be negotiating with a subcontractor to come do certain type of work for one project, but maybe for another project, their costs may change. Also, when they're not with you, you want to inactivate their user license because you don't want to pay for them if they're not working on a project, but you still want to be able to have them available in any skill set searching you want to do. And then again, knowing their availability is always a challenge because we don't control these subcontractors. Also, we want to be cognizant of making sure we're spending the right amount of licensing on managing our subcontractors. So there's a few ways we see clients managing that. And then obviously, as subcontractors, if they have access to OpenAir, we want to make sure they have very limited visibility into other data. So accessing subcontractors, we see two different scenarios, and these are generally where you are contracting with vendors based on an hourly basis. And so you're going to bill your customer for the hours that a contractor spends. And so, we have seen where contractors are set up as a user in OpenAir, and they have login, and they enter their time, very similar to other resources in OpenAir. The plus side is you have visibility, you have you can go through the whole approval processes, and everything works the way that it does for other users. The downside is the cost, right? You are burning a license in OpenAir to accommodate the contractor. But as contractors are interwoven in your team, if they're part of your team and it's just they're not going away, then obviously giving them user accounts and makes a lot of sense. We do have some customers where they are provided like a number of contractors by a general vendor. So vendor A is providing us 10 resources that's going to do work on different projects. We don't want to set up 10 user accounts. So what we've seen there is where we'll set up a single user account for vendor A. And then vendor A will be granted access. They can come in and enter the time spent by the different contractors against the different projects. You can use the notes and description field on the time entry to determine the contractor that did the work. And in that scenario, you're only burning a single license versus burning the 10 otherwise would be needed. And the benefit there, obviously, is you're saving costs. You're freeing up, you're not burning licenses. Obviously, the downside is you do have some limited reporting. So you're limited to being able to report at the time entry level. and for users. You have some limited invoicing capabilities in that scenario as well. So it can definitely be a workable situation for some customers. Some customers, it can't be a workable situation. So it just depends. But I've also seen some customers that have a combination of both approaches, right? So they have some contractors that they are allowed in OpenAir. They treat them like they do any other project resource, and they enter their time. And then they have another set of contractors that are handled by the general vendor entering their time. So it's not a one fit scenario. You can, combine these two different approaches depending on your scenario and what makes sense. You do want to, if you are setting up subcontractors in OpenAir, you definitely want to be able to tag them as a subcontractor, because there'll be some reporting requirements you'll have that you'll want to either include or exclude subcontractors. And so there's a few different options. Really simply, you could just create a custom field that tags a user as a subcontractor or an employee. However, we recommend with our customers that this is a great use case for entity tags. The entity tags allow you to be able to create a custom, drop-down list of, in this case, employment statuses, and then be able to timestamp those. So if a contractor is a contractor between, January and March, you can mark them through an entity tag that they were active contractor between those dates. And then when you do your reporting, if you include or exclude contractors, based on that information. The other real benefit of a tag group is if you have contractors or employees converting. So we've seen more so where a contractor will become an employee, and occasionally we see it the other way around. But rather than managing two different users, having to lose the history of the contractor but working with you, you can just use the same user record, but using entity tags, you can date stamp when they were a contractor, now they're an employee, and then ultimately, if they ever leave the company, you can use this to also date stamp their termination and the time they were an employee. And this really comes in handy. Mostly we see with utilization reporting, where you want to exclude potentially contractors, but you only want to include employees and only while they were an active employee. And this helps in being able to get a really solid utilization denominator based on the work schedule follows the entity tag dates. So that works really well. The basic custom field is available if you were to use generic users for some reason, also users obviously, but if you're using entity tags, those are only going to be set on user records. Those are not available anywhere else in the system. Maybe someday it'll be for projects. One can only hope. So the first thing we hear when we talk about contractors with customers is like, oh, well, we got to make sure they can only do certain things, or they can only see certain things. So really, this is where we recommend, having a role specific to contractors. And so that role would be limited to only the things that you won't allow them to do. Maybe we don't want them to be able to see projects. We don't want them to be able to see invoicing information, or, so between the role and the filter set and the access module permissions, you can craft a very limited role for a contractor to log in, where they only can do what you need them to do, which generally is enter time and potentially enter expenses. You may have contractors though that are, acting as project managers or other need other permissions. So in that case, you can decide, or give them the same permissions, roles, and filter sets as my normal project managers, or would I need some version that gives them slightly less functionality and access? So you have to take those considerations in place depending on the scenario you're under to make sure. One gotcha that we've run into with customers, there was a feature that was pushed out probably a couple of years ago, where you can mark an assignment group as automatically add users to the group. So this is really handy if you have an all-employee assignment group that you're using maybe on your internal projects, you create a user, and all of a sudden that user gets added to the group. You don't have to actually take any action. You don't have to remember to do so. But it could also come to bite you if you don't remember to remove the contractor from that group when you create them. So be careful there. It's a great little feature. We do recommend it, but if you are creating contractors, you need to take the extra step to remove them because you don't want them seeing your internal projects, PTO projects, those types of things when they're putting their time in. So just a word of advice. We see customers using skill profiles to track certain key elements for determining who's a good fit. You know, it could be as simple as just the region, the job category or job role, but you could also obviously get down to more finite skill sets, technical skill sets, functional capabilities. And you know, you want to include your contractor in that. And so being able to have that at the contractor level helps you be able to, you know, select that contractor. But a lot of times when you're trying to find resources, you might have contractors that are not currently working on projects, but did work in the past and had a profile. So not to worry, there is the opportunity in the new advanced research search where you can actually search for inactive resources. And so this would allow you to have those profiles on your contractors, be able to have them inactive, but still be able to pull them up in searches. So they might be a great fit. You may reach out to them and see if they're available if you have, you know, if you don't have another internal resource available. So it's a good little tool here. Also, cost is another searchable element if you're, you know, searching. So we'll talk about costs in a few slides around how to manage that, but you can also search the cost as well if you're looking for that, if that's part of your decision process. So this screens kind of show a few things, shows the inactive and the costing. And then the other thing, we mentioned entity tags earlier. You can actually use entity tags in the search process as well. So if you maybe are limited to searching for contractors or searching for employees or other elements of your entity tags that may be beneficial, you can pull those in as well and search. So just another parameter to which you can pull into this advanced resource search process. So speaking of cost, being able to report on project profitability is always a key metric and KPI that just about every professional service organization looks at. And obviously subcontractors can be a minor or major attribute for costs. So, you know, we've seen a few different strategies here. We've seen where you can just go in and get an invoice from your contractor and go in and create an expense report. So you could create an expense item for contractor costs. You could then enter that invoice that you received as a contractor cost item, and then have that as your costing method for the project. So as you're doing your profitability, you would include those, obviously your expense reports as part of that cost factor. Also, OpenAir does have a purchasing module. It is basically meant for tracking vendor costs that are not based on hours. So you may outsource work to your vendor, and they may fixed fee that work. And so in that scenario, you know, you don't need them to log into OpenAir and enter time because you're not paying them for the time and you're not costing the product based on the time. So in that scenario, you could create a vendor PO or purchase item in the purchase module. And we see this really handy is integrating with in the backend financial system. So for example, if you have NetSuite, we can bring over, you know, subcontractor vendor bills from NetSuite into OpenAir and create those as purchase items. And then that would apply your costs. And it also allows you to do rebilling back to your customer using purchase billing rules as well. So that's another strategy depending on your relationship and with your contractors. And then lastly, we've been talking about them actually entering time. That's probably what we see most common is where, or at least a subset of contractors are set up to actually enter their time because we need to be able to bill that time back to our customer. So having a cost associated with that timesheet, and then using that in your profitability calculations. And then again, it's not a one fit all. You could have a combination of these strategies depending on, you may have some subcontractors that bid the work and on a fixed fee, other contractors you want to bill their time hourly. So a combination of these two is probably very common in what we see from customers. So timesheet approach, you want to be able to have them very limited to what projects they're on. You can control those by task assignments or bookings. Do you want them to receive late timesheet alerts? A lot of times we'll want to exclude contractors, but you may not. If they are a full-time contractor, then maybe you want them to receive alerts. So there's a few options for controlling those alerts. And then lastly, if you are working with an hourly contractor, they're billing you hourly, you're billing them hourly, and they're entering their hours. We have to make sure there's a way to reconcile those hours. So you've invoiced me for X amount of hours. How do I reconcile that that I see those same amount of hours in the system, or I don't see those amount of hours in the system? And then how do I reconcile that? So there's a really sweet, cool way that OpenAir is set up to do that, and I'll show you that. I'm actually going to do that in a live environment in a few slides. Around timesheet alerts, there's a couple of ways you can limit timesheet alerts for contractors. Obviously, if you use the timesheet required on a user, you can uncheck that for contractors. If they really are part-time, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. You may not want them to get the alerts. This would be one way to do that. The other way we've seen it is you could use a department to group your contractors together, and then use a department to filter out contractors in your alerts. So that's another way to do it. Also is a good way to be able to filter out contractors in other views, resourcing as well, using a department. So a couple of different ways you can do that if you want to not send those overdue timesheet alerts to your contractor. Costing always can be complicated because usually contractors, they'll negotiate a cost, but then they may be filling different roles, and they may have different costs for different work that you are asking them to provide. And so you can set a user cost similar to an employee on their user record. This will, by itself, this will drive a cost factor to your project margin. But maybe at this project level, the contractor who otherwise was $50 an hour is going to charge you $60 an hour because it's a higher level role or more expertise. So there is the ability to turn on project level cost override and be able to set those project level cost override so that as the time is entered, you would pick up the override cost instead of the user level cost. And then maybe even more complicated, could a contractor actually have varying costs on the same project? That's actually, we run into this with customers. They may have a different cost rate for task A, but a different cost rate for task B. And so in that scenario, you can actually extend that cost override feature down to the task and then have the task be able to drive the cost. And so OpenAir is smart enough to know when you have these features enabled, the cost overrides, when time is entered and approved, the first thing the system will do is look to see if there's a task override. If there is, it'll pick that top cost up. If not, it'll look for the project. And then lastly, it'll go back to the user. And whichever cost it finds first will be the cost that actually gets stamped onto the time entry. So, and again, a combination of these is fairly typical within using the contractors. Marking time entries as paid. So I mentioned earlier, this is kind of the cool feature that allows you to kind of manage. A lot of times customers come to say, you know what, the contractor worked so many hours, but they only invoiced us for a sub portion of those hours. And how do we figure out how to, what we're missing and do that validation, and then how do we accrue those hours in our financial system, so we get the costs in our financial system in the correct system, and we're able to see, exactly what was invoiced and what's remaining to be invoiced. So there's in the time entry, in the time module, everyone's aware you can get to time entries, which allows you to slice and dice your time entry data without the need for reporting. But what you may not be aware is you can add functionality into that time entry by creating a couple of custom fields. It's not a switch that support turns on. It literally is driven by these custom fields. And so one of the custom fields is a drop down, and it's a reconciled custom field. And you can set the drop down values to anything you like. In this example, we have open, invoiced, and paid that we could use. And then there's a notes field that you custom field. And the custom fields have to be exact. So if you're interested in setting this up, if you don't have this already, email us. And I'll be happy to give you the exact custom fields that are needed. And then that turns on a bulk action view, as well as being able to add those fields to the time entries. And let me show you what this looks like in a real system. So here in our sandbox, I've got Ron Bro. He's contractor. Ron sent us he sent us an invoice, but he sent us an invoice for 19 hours. He did not send us an invoice. So I take Ron's invoice and I can see what hasn't been reconciled yet. And I can come in here and say, okay, I see that Ron sent us an invoice. I see that he did not send us the March invoice. So that's the half an hour we're missing, but he sent us everything for February. So I come in here and grab everything I want that matches up. I can come into my bulk actions now. And I could say, let's set reconciled to paid. And we can say, paid on INV 123. You could also use this to put like the period of time in which they were paid, so August invoice, etc. So now what's happened is you'll see my time has disappeared because I'm filtering on reconciled. If I want to go back and look at what time has been paid, I can see what time has been paid. I can see my notes here as well. So then if I want to report on what time is in the system, I can then filter on this reconciled in my report to show anything that has not been paid. And then I can use the cost to pull into that report as well. That will show me how much to accrue for for one contractor or for my team of contractors. I can run this across all contractors. So it's a cooler way to be able to see, and a lot of times we see customers using this feature, and by using this feature, we don't even require an invoice. So by doing this, I can say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pay Ron for February based on the hours he entered in the system. I'm coming up with 19 hours. So now I will pay Ron 19 hours times his rate. And then, next month or the next pay period, I'll go back in, look at the hours Ron entered, and I'll see what hasn't been paid yet. And then I'll pull that data. And in that scenario, I'm paying basically straight from the time entry, and I'm not having to bother my contractor to even send me an invoice, because I'm going to pay based on what I see in approved timesheets. And so that's another way to kind of get more efficient potentially at the way you calculate how much the contractors are needing to get paid. Access for your vendors. Again, we want to be cognizant of what we want them to see based on what role they're playing. We often see where we want to be able to show them scheduling data. What are the bookings they have for upcoming work? Maybe show them time information, time reports, either for them or for their team if they're being provided by a vendor. So those are generally the types of reports that we are giving access to our vendors. We may make sure, if you've got reports using filter sets or embedded filter sets in the reports, if you're creating a bulk report and then going to share that with on dashboards for users if they can only see their own data. So making sure you have the right filter sets there as well. And again, timesheet compliance, again, if they are a full-time contractor, the vendor reconciliation is something you'll want to report on for if you want to do any sort of accruals, and then obviously your costing for your profitability. So those are all kind of key reports that we include both to the vendor as well as internally. And then obviously, you want to report on your costing. Are you costing correctly? Do we need to hire more employees versus more contractors? Obviously, making sure your skill sets are being leveraged if that's something that's beneficial. What is your revenue ratio delivered by employees versus contractors? So you can create nice little reports that you can show in nice graphs to show how much of my revenue or my invoicing or even my time I'm entering is driven by employees versus contractors. And that could be a really good KPI to keep your eye on, knowing that, do you need to hire more employees versus contractors? And obviously revenue forecasting and utilization forecasting looking forward for both employees versus subcontractors. So in summary, subcontractors are necessary for most professional service organizations. They do fill a gap. They're extremely valuable. So you just want to make sure you think through the process you want OpenAir to help you with, to make sure that you give them the right access, or if they need access, or get their cost in correctly, and make sure you're monitoring any metrics for your subcontractor usage. If you're using the skills, you should include the subcontractor in that process because there's value there. And then obviously, engage your OpenAir admin when you start thinking through this process to make sure that you got your roles and your filter sets and your module access all set correctly for your contractors. So that concludes today's presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for joining. Who we are. This is what we do. We're passionate about professional services, and OpenAir is our tool of choice. So if you need any information, feel free to hit our website. We have a few other options for contacting us. And again,